A jar full of stones. A professor walked slowly into his classroom as the students chatted amongst themselves. As he entered, the noise slowly quieted. Once it was silent, he looked around mysteriously. Everyone stared down at him, wondering what was happening. After waiting what seemed to be an eternity, he reached from under his table and pulled out a glass jar. The jar was filled to the brim with large stones, the kinds you might find on a riverbank. The professor looked down at the jar, then back up at the students. Finally, he broke the silence. Loudly, with sincerity in his voice, he inquired of the students, "Is this jar full?" The students looked around at each other, wondering if it was a trick. They looked again at the jar, and again saw that it was indeed full to the top. Most of them nodded, and some yelled, "Yes, of course," back to the professor. He nodded as a response, and looked again around the room. He waited a moment, then reached back under the table. The pebbles. From the table, he pulled a large bag. The bag was filled with a large amount of small pebbles. He immediately tipped the bag of pebbles into the jar. Slowly but surely, and with a little bit of shaking, the pebbles filled the spaces between the cracks of the large stones. The bag of pebbles had been emptied. The jar was now full to the brim with large stones and small pebbles. The professor looked around the room and asked, "Now, is the jar full?" The students all laughed, realizing they had been wrong before. They agreed, however, that yes, the jar was definitely full. The professor smiled quirkily. The sand. He reached down and pulled yet another bag from underneath his desk. This bag was filled with sand. He slowly poured the sand into the jar of stones and pebbles, and the class watched as the sand fell into the tiny spaces between all of the rocks. It seemed as though every possible space was filled from the bottom until the top. At this point, the students did not know what to think. They had once again been fooled. There was, in fact, room enough for the entire bag of sand. The professor looked around the room once again. He again asked the class, "Is the jar full?" The class was now very hesitant, but the jar was very clearly full to the brim with stones, pebbles, and sand. Surely nothing else could possibly fit inside. Yet they stayed silent and waited. The tea. The professor smiled and said, "I see that you are learning." He again reached under his table and produced a tea kettle. He slowly poured the steaming brew of tea into the jar full of stones, pebbles, and sand. The tea soaked into the sand and made its way throughout the entire jar. Just like everything before, it too was able to fit into the jar, a jar that everyone had just agreed was totally full. The students all chuckled to themselves, amazed that they had yet again been surprised by this jar with a seemingly endless amount of space inside. Your life, a jar of time. Finally, the professor offered his explanation of what this all meant. "The jar is a lot like your life," he explained. You can choose what you decide to fill it with, whether that is with stones, pebbles, or sand, and that is up to you. The large stones are the bigger, more important things in your life. They are the things that are the most important to you, the things that you can never do without. These are things like your family, your friends, your passions, and your health. The pebbles are the other important things in your life, but the things that aren't completely irreplaceable. These are things like your car, your job, or even your phone. In the end, you can do without these kinds of things. And of course, the sand is everything else. The entertainment, the small stuff that we enjoy doing, but maybe isn't very important. This might include things like having nice socks, looking at social media, watching TV, and playing video games. Not to say it isn't fun, but ultimately, we could easily do without it. Balancing your jar of time. Balance is important in all things, and it is possible to have too much of anything. This includes the big, important things. If you spend too much time worrying about those things, it's possible you might miss out on some of the small pleasantries of life. On the other hand, if you put too much time into the sand, you will find that you just don't have any room for the big stuff anymore. The professor looked out into the class one more time and asked two final questions. How many stones and pebbles do you have in your jars? How much of it is filled with sand? One student raised her hand and asked pointedly, "But, Professor, what about the tea?" "Of course," he said. "No matter what, always save room for a glass of tea. Earl Grey, hot."